Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with one of my favorite historians, Geoffrey Wawro, who is the American Professor of Military History at the University of North Texas, which is in Dallas, and the director of the UNT Military History Center, the author of a large number of books, several of which I just love. I haven't read the rest. The Franco-Prussian War, 2003. My favorite, Quicksand, America's Pursuit of Power in the Middle East, that was 2010. The Vietnam War, most recently, that's the one we're going to talk about today. And another that I really love, A Mad Catastrophe, the outbreak of World War I and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. So welcome, Jeff.
Hi, Clyde. Good to see you again.
You've come to North Dakota a number of times. The last time you did was for a symposium I hosted on the 1960s. And I asked you to talk about Vietnam because it was the 1960s, and you did. I won't claim credit for your writing this massive tome on Vietnam, but the idea has been in your mind for a while.
That was a great sort of multidisciplinary conference where you had the politics, the culture, the art, the counterculture, the music, and then I did the war, you know? I always get the dirty jobs.
And it's so interesting, you know, Robert Caro, I'm sure you're aware of his work, writing the massive, definitive, authoritative biography of LBJ. And the most recent one, The Ascent of Power, I believe, talking about Johnson's frustration during his time as vice president. And then suddenly there's November 2nd, 1963. Johnson takes charge. In my view, the 100 pages that Robert Caro writes about the first week of the Johnson administration are some of the best writing I have seen in my time. But, you know, he's ancient now. He's an old man. And Vietnam, the Great Society, how will he finish this book? Because Vietnam, you have found to your own satisfaction, can't be written in 200 pages.
No, and he'll write it the way he's written the other, four volumes? And 4 volumes doesn't even begin to describe it because each volume is like 4 books, you know. So it's it's like a 20 volumes when you boil it down. But no, he'll do it the way he's done it all, you know. What is it? Always turn the page, you know. It's like he never leave a page unturned when he goes to the Johnson Library and other archives. And I imagine it will be outstanding. I don't think it's going to change our understanding of his conduct of the war. I think it will illuminate a lot of the decisions he made and a lot of the pushback he got and a lot of the good and bad counsel he received.
And he's writing a biography of Johnson. That's not what you did. Your title explicitly says it's a military history of Vietnam. So that's quite a different lens, isn't it?
Yes. Johnson is central to my book as well because he's the commander in chief. He holds the generals on a very short leash. You know, he famously says that, you know, they can't even bomb an outhouse in North Vietnam without my permission. You know, that's how strict the rules of engagement are over North Vietnam. On the larger front, LBJ was he really thought that Kennedy had been too delicate in his approach, and LBJ thought, I don't really understand what's so hard. Why would a country as big and powerful and wealthy as the United States have a problem defeating a country as small and insignificant as North Vietnam? His big concern was that it would escalate like the Korean War, that the Chinese would come into the war, or maybe even the Soviets, if the U.S. fought, you know, too aggressively and pushed all the way up to the Chinese border, or went into Laos and Cambodia, or bombed Hanoi, or bombed Haiphong. The rules of engagement were not, you know, out of delicacy about not wanting to kill North Vietnamese. The rules of engagement were about not wanting to provoke a Chinese or Soviet intervention in the war. But as a result, he never got more than sort of half results in North Vietnam because he was always too careful to like avoid upsetting them. And that just gave the war legs, you know. It just that made it easier for them to mobilize, deploy, and keep the necessary number of infiltrators and supplies moving, you know, through the DMZ or down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam.
You know the cliche. Why didn't he just let the generals do the war? Why did he meddle? We can't win wars if they're being micromanaged by someone like Lyndon Johnson. Talk about that. Is that a misconception?
No, I mean, you know, a really great book about the origins of the war is The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam.
Wonderful book.
Yeah. And, you know, he gets into that in that kind of anecdotal, chatty, systematic, methodical way that Halberstam always does, because he was sort of the Bob Woodward of his day. So he had access to all these White House and, you know, Pentagon, State Department insiders who kind of, told him stories about the meetings and what happened, or leaked to him. Both Kennedy and Johnson had huge skepticism about the military. Kennedy said something like, they have all this, macho, muscular stuff, and they're always preferred by Congress people and by journalists because they got like the solution for everything. It's just more force. But at the end of the day, they're not very bright. And Kennedy is somebody who says, this war is unwinnable from the outset. He says the Viet Minh, now the Viet Cong, they're nowhere and they're everywhere at the same time. They're an enemy of the people, and yet they're loved by the people. He says this during the Truman administration.
This is John F. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy. So when the generals, start agitating for more troops and, ground troops, more aircraft, more targets, and more escalation, Kennedy says no, because he says that if I allow them in more than an advisory capacity, they will take over the mission, and then it will become completely militarized, and then the war will just take on a life of its own. Because it is the way it is, an enemy that's nowhere and yet everywhere, an enemy that's an enemy of the people and yet loved by the people, because it's that way, and because this alternative is so despised by the people for its corruption, for its lack of concern for their realities, that, Kennedy says this is going to be a loser. The only reason Kennedy stays engaged in it is because he sees it as a piece of this global game of containment. So he needs to put in just enough to keep South Vietnam alive, but he can't yoke himself too closely to this regime, because when he's president, it's Ngo Dinh Diem, who's a hugely unpopular figure. And he has some qualities, but he's generally disliked by most of the South Vietnamese people. And so Kennedy says, I'm going to keep him going as an alternative to Ho Chi Minh, but I'm not going to put the military in, because they'll take over the mission. And then it will just become, the whole mission will become the war. And it will just go on and on and on, much like Vietnam actually did go on, or Afghanistan went on later, without any real solution being arrived at. But then when LBJ Johnson comes in, he takes the opposite view. Well, I respect Kennedy's view, but I think that, we can just go in there and, nail the coonskins to the wall and just get it over with.
So, Professor Wawro, let's get this on and off the table. One of the most persistent debates in American political history is what Kennedy would have done had he lived and had a second term. And the Theodore Sorensen camp says he would have wound down the war, and the others say, oh, no, there's no evidence of that. Kennedy gave clues in both directions on this. What do you think would have happened had Kennedy lived?
For Kennedy, the dominant factor was that he was up for re-election in 1964. And he was going to be running against someone like Ronald Reagan or Barry Goldwater or Richard Nixon. All of them were, grandstanding about Vietnam and saying how the Democrats were fumbling it, and that if a Republican was in charge, they'd just go in and finish the war and win. It wasn't politically expedient for Kennedy in 1962, 63 to be saying that this regime in South Vietnam is a loser. I'm pulling out. I'm going to leave it to the Viet Cong communists. He had to play the game of politics, and he had to talk tough, and he had to talk about holding the line against the spread of international communism. But in his internal White House meetings with his inner circle, he made clear his distaste and utter dissatisfaction with the state of affairs in South Vietnam. Right before he was assassinated in the fall of 63, he gave instructions to one of his chief deputies to explore all options for after the election, including getting out.
I've been working on this a little bit, on the interstices between administrations. So Jefferson retires, Madison becomes president, Meriwether Lewis gets caught in the crossfire or in the gap, and that leads to his demise. Truman becomes president on the April 12th, 1945, when FDR dies at Warm Springs. He's told that day of the existence of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, has to make a decision within weeks about something that he has had no prior attempt to process. Johnson becomes an accidental president in the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. As you say, he's been kept out of many of the meetings, but he has a general sense of Kennedy's way of thinking about such things. Did Johnson think he owed anything to JFK as he pursued his own policies in Vietnam?
First of all, he didn't even have to be in on a lot of these meetings. If you were an American at the time reading Time or Newsweek or Life magazine, or U.S. News World Report, you were exposed to a lot, or the New York Times, to Neil Sheehan and David Halberstam and all the great Malcolm Brown, all the great journalists, Maggie Higgins, that were writing from Vietnam about what was really going on. So, in other words, you can't just say, "Oh, well, Kennedy didn't have him on the inside, so he did." No, there was plenty of open source information on Vietnam that would have led you to believe that this was not a safe bet, right? As to what did he owe Kennedy anything? Well, obviously he kept on, all the principal cabinet members and advisors like McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor, Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State. He kept on all these Kennedy people as a sign of continuity with Kennedy. But there was a difference. Johnson, had all this legislation teed up on civil rights and on the Great Society, the war on poverty. He thought Kennedy had been an ineffective legislator. He was much better because he'd been master of the Senate, right? Senate Majority Leader. And he had, he like someone like Fulbright, he had put him in there. So, so he has all these people seated in all the major committees are run by Southerners, and which were known and many beholden to Lyndon, right? So he feels like he can be more successful. So that's where his focus is, and he sees Vietnam from the outset as being just a distraction, an annoyance, perhaps a necessary evil, but it needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with quickly because the hawks in Congress, which include all the Southern Democrats, some of the Southern Democrats are as hawkish as the most hawkish, Goldwater type Republicans, right? And they all they're not big on social spending, so they're like, hey, we'll give you as much money as you want for the war in Vietnam, no matter how stupid the war it is, we'll give you money for it, but we're going to take it out of the Great Society. So Johnson's his whole presidency, he's in this juggling act, trying to keep his domestic programs going while continuing war spending.
We need to take a short break. We're talking to Geoffrey Wawro, my favorite historian of military history, a number of excellent books, most recent Vietnam, A Military History. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm sitting across virtually, at least from my friend Geoffrey Wawro, who is a professor of history at the University of North Texas, the author of many books, fascinating, most recently, Vietnam, A Military History. So, Geoffrey, let's talk about how this happened. So you said at the end of the first segment that Lyndon Johnson inherits the presidency. He thinks that Vietnam is a distraction and an annoyance, as you put it, and his real fascination is social policy, domestic policy, the Great Society, the war on poverty, civil rights, and yet Vietnam ate his presidency. How did that happen?
Because the war took on this vast momentum of its own that John F. Kennedy had predicted. Kennedy had been aware that once you engage the Pentagon in anything, the demands increase, the funding has to increase. The Pentagon is tied into Congress. They have all their partisans on the Hill, so they'll get more funding, and the funding has to come from somewhere. Remember, this was a time before when we still believed in balanced budgets. When they're when deficits, we were running a small deficit, but that small deficit seemed enormous to people in the United States at the time. 20 billion seemed enormous, and so they're like, okay, well, you got to cover that deficit. So, during the Vietnam War, Johnson is forced to implement a 10% surtax on income. So you'll get tax due, and then there'll be another line below that, and then you take 10% of your AGI and then throw that in too, because they were so worried about deficits and the cost of this war, in addition to the Medicare, Medicaid, all the other programs of the Great Society. The war just becomes bigger and bigger. And how does it sort of eat the Johnson presidency? Because this is what the book is all about. That's why it's a military history. It's much more than a military history in a way, but I feel like so many Vietnam histories have just sort of dabbled here and there in military operations and then really focused on the food fights in Washington, right? Whereas those food fights in Washington are really influential over the course of the war because they determine funding, levels of troops, missions, authorization to go into neutral countries like Laos and Cambodia, or authorization to bomb more in places like North Vietnam. Johnson is trying to fight this war against this heavy infiltration from North Vietnam and this growing recruitment of VC inside South Vietnam. he never has more than 540,000 troops. If you net that against all the people needed for like combat support in the rear echelons, that yields on a good day 70,000 combat troops. So out of that 543,000, only like 70,000 at the most were available for combat. So then you take a country the size of South Vietnam with as poor an infrastructure as South Vietnam. There's no way you're going to snuff out this insurgency against this hugely popular communist movement with just 70,000 combat troops, plus like 20,000 South Koreans, plus like 6,000 Australians, plus 1,000 New Zealanders, right? No, it's not going to happen. And yet the demands, I point out in the war, they go on all these like operations, and they usually don't make contact with the enemy. But the operation still costs a lot of money. You're still flying the same number of helicopter sorties, TAC air sorties, tactical air, where you're bombing, thinking that there's enemy there. So the costs just keep going up and up and up and up because there's no relent on that end of firepower. But they're not really engaging with the enemy because the enemy has figured out how the Americans operate from this air mobile, fire intensive posture. So every time the Americans are coming, they know they're coming because they're setting up these fire bases, landing zones. They're going out on these walks in the sun looking for the enemy. Enemy just hangs back, waits till they move on to another area, and then they reemerge and take back all the villages they've been controlling, right? So it's a war without end formula. And Johnson blunders right into it, whereas Kennedy had seen the risks and said that this is what it's going to become. And he was only holding the line to get reelected for his second term in 1964. And then I think he would have wound down and Vietnamized the war.
I get it. Johnson also, I believe, said he didn't want to be the first president to lose a war, and then Nixon said the same thing and so on. So there's a whole kind of toxic masculinity element in all of this too. Let's say there had been no politics. Let's say we lived in a benevolent dictatorship and we could do anything we wanted, and the only answer was win this war. How would that have looked?
Well, to win the war in 1972, Nixon launches Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2. These are these big air campaigns, the first since the end of Rolling Thunder, which was terminated by Johnson in October of 1968. So this was a return to bombing of North Vietnam, but it was not at all in the LBJ. LBJ had been very surgical, had been very careful. American pilots that were bombing in North Vietnam, said we fly two-seaters so that the guy in the back seat can read the rules of engagement aloud to the guy in the front seat flying the plane, right? There were all kinds of restrictions on what you could bomb to avoid the intervention of China or the Soviet Union. And Nixon just gets rid of all those restrictions and just goes crazy and hits bridges, oil depots, military bases, warehouses. What industry North Vietnam had bombs right up to into Hanoi and Haiphong, mines Haiphong Harbor, and really all the infrastructure, all the power generation network just destroyed. North Vietnam plunged into darkness, and this really had an impact. This really brought them to the table. In the Linebacker 2 raids, for example, which was like a week of bombing around Christmas, also known as the Christmas bombing, like at least 4,000 North Vietnamese civilians killed. All of our NATO allies were like, this is inhumane, this is barbaric. It is like, if Johnson had done this, if Nixon had done this earlier, there would have been this, it would have caused problems in the Western alliance, right? America was trying to stand as this kind of pillar of human rights and virtue against the dastardly Soviet Union and the international communism, right? And so this was not a good look for us to be just like carpet bombing North Vietnam and exploding the dikes to flood the countryside and drown the peasants. That was just not going to work. But that said, that certainly had an effect.
I guess this begs the ultimate question: could the war have been won?
If we had been fighting a war against South Vietnam, yes. But fighting a war against North Vietnam, no. That regime was so disciplined and so kind of proud, and it was not going. It had just fought this decades-long struggle against the French, and driven them out, and been on the brink of unification when the Geneva Conference intervenes and. People like Mao Zedong that the North Vietnamese assumed would support them ended up being okay with a two-state solution. So they felt screwed in every way by their friends and enemies. That made them want to fight all the more.
So if the war could not have been won, surely there were people with strategic understanding who knew history, who knew the history of the region, who knew what had happened to the French, who knew that we were in a post-colonial era, that knew the proximity of China and the Soviet Union and the possibility of touching off a Korea-like war. Why weren't those voices able to prevail?
There's one figure that I talk about in both Kennedy and Johnson administrations, George W. Ball. And George W. Ball was kind of like the in-house skeptic. During Kennedy's presidency, Averell Harriman was another. Harriman, because he was old and rich enough and powerful enough that he didn't fall into the trap of groupthink. Ball, because he was very principled and smart and could see, and he constantly compared what we were doing to what the French did, and talked about, when Kennedy sent, increased advisors for the umpteenth time, Ball said, in a couple of years we're going to have 300,000 troops in the jungles and paddies of South Vietnam, and they're going to get lost in there, And I mean, Kennedy's response was, "Oh, George, you're crazy." He couldn't see that happening. There were these voices, and under Kennedy, it was because Kennedy thought he could control the war. He was only acting hawkish to get reelected, and then he was going to say, okay, now this South Vietnamese government has to sink or swim on its own. We'll help, but if they can't do it, we're not going to go and save their bacon.
Which is what Nixon did 9 years later, saying it's time for South Vietnam. We'll train them. We'll get them ready. They're going to have to finish this war themselves, and that was a total debacle.
Right, and so you can imagine if that experiment had been attempted under Kennedy, it would have gone even more poorly, right? But that's no criticism of the policy. It was the right policy. It's more like we were applying that policy to a government and a society that just wasn't willing to fight at all costs for its survival in the way that the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong were. I mean, I talk about how, in all these operations spread across the war, like 90% of American and ARVN operations do not make contact with the enemy. Though 10% that do, the beating that these communists took from American firepower. Imagine you're in a battle with the Americans, and they locate you. They say that if you're a battalion of North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam and you're located by the Americans, you don't survive more than a couple of days. I mean, they literally just, it's like they will hit you instantly. The artillery was always available because the whole country, and it's interesting, if you go to drive around Vietnam today, in southern Vietnam, central Vietnam, it's like the fire bases are still there. There's like an asphalt helipad. On every hilltop, there's an old fire base, right? So everywhere you went, you had active artillery fire, and then you had tactical air support. You had always had fighter bombers orbiting overhead, and you'd be like, we need fire on these coordinates, and they'd be right there, right? And then they had those those Puff the Magic Dragon, gunships that fired these Gatling guns that could appear, that were always orbiting in combat areas, and they could appear and lay down incredible fire. And then once the enemy kind of pulled back or started its retreat, the B-52s would come on quick runs from Thailand or Guam, right? And they would just carpet bomb lines of retreat, right? Or if you found them in a bunker line somewhere, you'd carpet bomb the bunker line, right? Point is the firepower was absolutely, devastating but they went on. I mean, the U.S. and the South Vietnamese would capture letters in the knapsacks of these North Vietnamese or Viet Cong troops, and they would have been writing a letter home and not finished it, and then capture it and be like, I cannot believe how devastating and terrifying all this is, but I have to do this because it's the right thing to do for the people of my country, and blah, blah, blah. Well, you never found anything like that in a South Vietnamese rucksack, right? This was a North Vietnamese Viet Cong thing, and there was nothing like it on the South Vietnamese side.
So intriguing what you're saying. At the time, Eisenhower talks about the domino theory, and then Kennedy talks about it, and so on. As you look back, half a century later, more than half a century later, what if we had just let the North take the South from the beginning. It seems now like we were caught in a myth, a Cold War and containment myth that had no actual validity. If it had been unified under communist rule in 1963, no real loss to American interests.
Yes, easy to say in retrospect, and I think it was more about base, right? Like, in other words, the U.S. didn't want to be pushed around in this way, and Ho Chi Minh had been, kind of courting the Americans and saying, "Oh, I'm not such a bad guy," and the Americans rebuffed him because of his Communist Party background and his links to Moscow and Beijing, right? So, you can see it was a typical Cold War standoff, and face was engaged, right? Reputation, and there, Kennan's whole containment idea was that, around the edges, you have to hold the line. You can't let this ink blot keep expanding, right? And so there's the idea, okay, well, we need to kind of backstop South Vietnam as a kind of fence post against the spread of communism. So all that, was defensible and made perfect sense. It's just that once we actually get engaged with them, first Truman, then Eisenhower, Truman has very just sort of passing familiarity with it. Eisenhower is the first one to really engage with it in a serious way, and Eisenhower is just startled by how just how unpopular the South Vietnamese regime is. You either had the French puppet emperor Bao Dai, who was left behind by the French, and then initially embraced by the Americans, but then he's pushed aside by his ambitious prime minister Ngo Dinh, who then embarks on this kind of reign of terror and bases himself on the 20% of the South Vietnamese population who are Roman Catholic, because he's a real Catholic bigot himself, and then thus alienates the vast majority of South Vietnamese, not just by his Catholicism, but by his just by his arrogance, his it's my way or the highway approach to things. One example, he renames the Viet Minh, which Viet Minh were like the Patriots or the Minutemen of the American Revolution. They were this bit of local legend, how they beat the British, and the Viet Minh had the same reputation for defeating the French and driving them out. And so they're still called the Viet Minh when the Americans get involved. And so Diem goes, we need to rebrand the Viet Minh. So he calls them the Viet Cong, which is like Vietnamese commie. And then he has, when they capture Viet Cong guerrillas, he makes them spit and urinate on Viet Minh battle flags and stuff like that. Well, none of this is very popular with the Vietnamese, because they just see what he's doing. We never attached ourselves to a winning side, right? We were always kind of chained to this corpse. And I think that's what Kennedy saw. Kennedy said, there's no future in this war. I'm going to play this thing out with advisors and try to help them until I get reelected for my second term. And then I think he would have said, it's time to Vietnamize the war.
How many My were there really?
Westmoreland, by the time My Lai happens, and by the time My Lai is exposed, a year after it happens, Westmoreland has left Vietnam. He's become the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C., and he deliberately sets out to create the impression that My Lai was a singular atrocity, that this happened once and the bad boys have been punished, even though they weren't. They initially were, but then they all got off. The ones that were indicted, that the Army decided not to try them because of lack of evidence, as if that was a problem. And then the one that did get thrown in jail, Nixon lets him out, 3 years later, right?
Lieutenant Calley.
But there was another one at My Cay, which was near My Lai, which a large number of civilians were massacred that day. But just in general, there would be undisciplined American units that would kill civilians, not on the scale of My Lai, but it would happen. And then just the bombing and the harassment and interdiction fire by the artillery, which was essentially unaimed, that was killing civilians all the time, right? And then I have a whole chapter about Operation Speedy Express in early '69 in the Mekong Delta, where U.S. troops go in and they generate a record high body count of 12,000 dead VC in the in a couple of provinces of the Delta. And this was General Julian Ewell and Colonel Ira Hunt. And it was completely fraudulent. Most of this 11,889 body count, most of them were civilians, and they were literally targeting civilians to get up the body count.
I mean, wait a minute, they're deliberately targeting civilians, collateral damage, to make sure they could claim that there were significant body counts.
Right, and it was part of this land rush in late 68, early 69 by Abe Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland, who said, I feel like there's going to be an armistice in Paris. They thought that these Paris talks that had been going under LBJ, that Nixon derailed, were still ongoing under Nixon. And they thought any day we'll have an armistice, so let's claw back. And the way to do this, they thought, was just to slaughter everybody, because then we'll kill the Viet Cong that are hidden in the midst of these people. So this chapter in my book, which is titled "I Will Not Be the First President to Lose a War," which is Nixon's justification for what he's doing, talks about Speedy Express, and which was bigger. That was a Me Lie every week for several months.
You mentioned Kissinger. Let's take a short break. When we come back, I want you to talk more about the complicity of Henry Kissinger. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Geoffrey Wawro, my friend from North Texas, a military historian, has a number of really extraordinary and fascinating books, including this one, Vietnam, A Military History. So I believe Henry Kissinger and Nixon had some serious conversations about this early on, and Kissinger said, look, we can't win this war. There's no way we can win this war. And Nixon agreed. And Nixon said, what should we do? And Kissinger said, just hang in there. At some point, we'll be able to cut and run. So, I mean, the cynicism of that, several tens of thousands of Americans were killed during that period, and, hundreds of thousands of people in Vietnam. The utter cynicism of continuing a war that you can't win to save face in that deliberate way is appalling, but I'm sure that's sort of standard fare too, isn't it?
You don't do full justice to the full weight of Henry Kissinger's cynicism. That's just something that my book gets into in some detail, because it's hugely important. The Vietnam War would have ended in October or November of 1968. It was on the way. Averell Harriman was leading this American delegation in Paris. Johnson had halted the bombing. Initially, everything like in most of North Vietnam, and then there was a strip along the DMZ that he continued to bomb. And by the end of October of 68, he stopped bombing there because they're so close to a peace deal. It's imminent. And Henry Kissinger at the time is a informal diplomat. He's a professor of government at Harvard, and he's an informal diplomat working for Dean Rusk, the American Secretary of State, and he's advising the American delegation, LBJ's delegation in Paris. But Kissinger is a very ambitious, very wily guy, and he wants entree to a Republican administration. So he reaches out to the Nixon campaign and says, hey, they're close to a peace deal here. We're close to a peace deal here, because he's part of the Johnson administration at this point. But let me be your mole inside the campaign so I can wreck this peace deal. But I want a place in the Nixon administration. As I argue in the book, the war would have ended in November of 68 with 30,000 American dead. Instead, the war ends January of 73 with twice as many American dead, 58,000 American dead, and hundreds of thousands more wounded. And this is to say nothing of all the South Vietnamese dead and all the enemy dead that didn't have to die in this war that would have been settled 4.5 years earlier.
Christopher Hitchens, as you know, wrote a famous book in which he said that Kissinger should be tried as a war criminal. From what you're saying, it sounds like that there's a plausible argument for that.
Kissinger took advantage of the fact that the South Vietnamese government, led by one of its generals, General Nguyen Van Tu, thought that if the Americans made peace in 68, his regime wouldn't survive. He didn't want peace because he thought peace under the conditions sought by Lyndon Johnson would just basically tee him up to be bowled over by the North Vietnamese after the peace. So, Kissinger was basically appealing to his fears. So the way Kissinger derailed the peace talks, he went to Thieu and said, Johnson and Humphrey are going to try to pressure you into signing this peace deal. Don't do it. Wait on us. If we win the election, we're going to get you a better deal. So, Kissinger and Nixon justify what they did with all kinds of lofty arguments saying, well, we were fighting for a better peace that would leave our ally in a better position and
Peace with honor.
and would better serve American interests. But what's really just repulsive about the whole thing is that the deal that Nixon and Kissinger got, 4.5 years later, was the exact same deal. Exact same deal. Nothing, not a jot different. For that, they cost another 28,000 American dead, hundreds of thousands of American wounded. And by the way, the wounds in the second half of the war were far worse than the first. All these multiple amputees because of the sophistication of these booby traps that they were getting better at making them, better at concealing them, making them far more potent than in the past. These horrible wounds were much higher, and then people were dying of their wounds at a much greater rate in the second half of the war than the first half of the war. So everything about it was just cloaked in like the worst kind of cynicism. And even when they were doing it, Nixon and Kissinger, and this is all in the book, because the book kind of shifts back and forth from Saigon to Washington and then into the jungles for the battles. But they knew what they were doing. And that's why Kissinger says in 1967, he says at a press conference, what we're really looking for is a decent interval. A decent interval. We need to prop them up long enough so that when they fall, which they will, it will look like a failure of South Vietnam and not a failure of the United States. So he knows this. And
he says this publicly. He says this publicly?
Yes.
Well, my Saigon 1975, the indelible photos of the helicopters leaving and people clinging to them and so on, in a certain sense echoed by our retreat from Afghanistan. But what an end to that war, right? Those images are almost as seared into the American consciousness as the Buddhist monk immolating himself on the streets of Saigon, or the famous shooting of the insurgent. Those photographs, or the Napalm Girl. Those photographs are amazingly powerful in American memory, and at least as powerful in my view as Saigon 1975.
Oh yeah, the photography, the imagery, the journalism around the war was a huge factor in turning opinion against the war. Of the police chief of Saigon shooting the VC prisoners, hands bound behind his back in the head. That was on the cover of every news magazine. So it was on every airplane, every doctor's waiting room, every newsstand in America, and that had a huge impact because people assumed that South Vietnam was a rule of law country and wasn't dictatorial and tyrannical like communist North Vietnam. And then you've got the police chief of Saigon, who's also the police minister of the whole country of South Vietnam, shooting this guy in the head in front of journalists. And, so all those images in a television age, in a big media saturated age, were hugely influential in turning opinion about the war. And that's why I talk about how this was the only war in American history, and certainly the last war in American history, where a journalist could go anywhere they wanted as long as they could find a helicopter or a truck willing to take them there. And they're getting all this stuff that was unfiltered by the censors. And that has not happened since.
So Tet Offensive 1968, afterwards, famously, Walter Cronkite goes to Vietnam and says, it's a quagmire. This all we can hope for is somehow to get out with some level of decency. And Johnson famously said, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost a nation. That's all true, isn't it?
Yes. Cronkite was not some bomb throwing radical. He was as sober and dispassionate an observer as there was, but he was also a sensible man. He not only went to Saigon, he went to Hue, he went all over the country and kind of embedded himself with units and kind of got a real feel for the war, and then had frank conversations with people, enlisted and commissioned people and civilians, and so kind of assembled it all in his mind and said, that the best that we can hope for is stalemate, right? And so it's time to wind this thing down.
And that had enormous influence in a way that nothing could in our age, because we still only had 3 networks, and Cronkite was one of the most beloved of all American people and regarded as fair-minded and centrist and so on.
And
So
if you look at Cronkite's audience versus the CBS evening news audience today it's minuscule. He was
right,
reaching everyone.
exactly. John Steinbeck went in 66, 67, and he, as you said, he embedded himself in the field, did all sorts of things that were really pretty dangerous, and came away. He was a friend of LBJ. He and his wife Elaine had stayed in the White House a number of times, comes back and writes a letter to one of LBJ's key aides and says, "We can't win this war. I'll continue to support the president, but we can't win this war." So lots of people were making the same conclusion about this time, and yet tragically, the war goes on for another 7 years, right?
Yeah. So Steinbeck, he's telling LBJ this in 67. Well, just like Kennedy in 63 is waging the war as part of the sort of background scenery to his campaign for re-election, so is LBJ. The difference is Kennedy kept it small enough that not a lot of Americans were being killed as a result of this play acting, right? Whereas Johnson has escalated the war, and now 200 Americans are dying every week in Vietnam, a week, and in service of this play acting that LBJ is not going to crumble before the communist threat, and he's going to stick it out and be tough and blah 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 blah. But even LBJ, he fully agrees with people like John Steinbeck that the war is unwinnable. He fully agrees with Cronkite that the war is unwinnable, and he keeps complaining. All my everybody around me is quitting on me. They're all saying the war. Bob McNamara used to be the one who was saying we could win this war. Now he's telling me we can't win it. Mac Bundy has left the administration to go to the Ford Foundation. It's like everybody's quitting on me. The only people that tell me I can win are the generals, and all they're telling me is bomb, 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 bomb some more. And so he's like, they won't give me any way to actually win the war, right? So he knows it's unwinnable, but he's trying to get reelected in 68, and he feels like if he either has to make that peace deal that Nixon derails, or he has to keep fighting. He'll show that he's not going to bow to international communism.
So let's leave JFK out of it for the moment, and Eisenhower. My impression is that there is a certain nobility in LBJ and a kind of a deep, almost tragic understanding of what was kind of roiling and destroying him. I don't feel any of the same respect for Richard Nixon. Is that fair?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, Nixon really believes that he's the realpolitiker, the sort of Bismarck, and that he sees things that the more idealistic Democrats don't see, right? And that he's willing to do like the hard things that their finer feelings won't let them do, their humanitarianism won't let them do, and that he's tough, And Nixon is just such a portrait in horrible cynicism and kind of sort of unresolved childhood issues, really, when you think about it. At the climax of his part of the Vietnam War, he's watching the movie Patton over and over and over again, conflating himself with George C. Scott. He's giving his White House advisors kind of Patton-esque speeches about, you got to just stick it in the gut and keep sticking it in, and there's no quitting Nixon, and he's just like horrible. He has this idea that he has to be so tough, and yet he, no less than the others, knows that he can't win the war,
He was a greater strategic thinker than LBJ, so he should have known better. He had a deeper understanding of history and strategy and geopolitical affairs, and yet there's this kind of damaged wound in him that makes him this tough guy on the war, right?
Yes, and I mean, I hate to say in fairness to Nixon, because I just think his conduct throughout was so appalling in every way. But he did have this plan, and the plan was separate North Vietnam from the Soviet Union and China by basically having that opening, that famous 1972 visit to Beijing, where he kind of throws over Taiwan and embraces communist China. And then he's gonna give the Soviets détente on the arms race in other areas, and in return they're gonna decrease their support for North Vietnam and support a two-state solution. And then he's going to combine this with increased ferocity in the war. He's not going to observe the neutrality of Laos and Cambodia. He's going to go into those countries and take out the North Vietnamese sanctuaries there, the supply lines, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He's going to bomb heavily in the north. Problem is, once he takes office, he faces the same obstacles that Johnson had. Growing public displeasure with the war. Even middle America by 1969 is turning against the war.
And growing congressional distaste for the war. So he no longer has a blank check.
No longer has a blank check because Congress is now really concerned about the economy. Inflation has doubled once, doubled again during the war because of all of these unfunded expenditures, no tax increase to sop up the stuff. Inflation has taken off. We're going to go off the gold standard.
But his strategy wasn't contemptible. Neutralize the Soviet Union, neutralize China, so they are no longer a factor.
In a perfect world, the strategy made perfect sense. The problem is it was very predictably overtaken by the realities of the Vietnam War. Is that the public and Congress had not become more accepting of a war in Vietnam because Nixon and Kissinger had vowed to take sterner measures. They were as sick of it as they were before. So when the casualties increase, the public says, wait a minute, I thought you had a secret plan to end the war. That's all they heard. They didn't hear the part about how I'm going to fight harder. They heard the part about how I have a plan to end the war.
How did you write this book? I take it you went to Vietnam.
Yes.
How long were you there?
I was there for about a month. I traveled all over to all the principal cities and then very remote places like Dien Bien Phu, Khe Sanh, A Shau Valley, to see all the, the major places like Hue and Saigon and Hanoi, but also to go off the beaten track and just to tour some of the more remote battlefields.
This was not your first rodeo, my friend. You've written about war and militarism and military affairs your whole career. How does one write this book? What archives are you looking at? How much research does this require?
Well, it was a lot. And one key advantage in that, I was undertaking this study at a time when a lot of stuff was declassified that hadn't been declassified, for earlier books about the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of stuff that had just, not because of FOIAs or demands, but just, the lapse of 25 years and stuff becomes available. So there was a lot of material I could tell had not been looked at. The way I looked at it is I want to understand this war. How did these presidents fight it? Like, how did they decide to do it? What was the advice they were getting? What was the plan they were pursuing? And then as the war began and ground forward, like what was the feedback they were getting from the field? They were actually seeing the evidence of operations. They were seeing the evidence of intelligence collection and that sort of thing. How were they updating their strategy in light of these discoveries? It was, MACV was a great source. They kept very detailed archives of everything they were doing, and anything that was important, they copied the White House, they copied the Pentagon, they copied the State Department, they copied the CIA director. So you could see like the most important stuff at a glance because it was stuff that got copied. If there was a study from the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff about the performance of their own troops, they would translate it and copy it into this stuff. So you could really see, and then they said, if you want more on this, go to this file. So I could really follow the war from the perspective of decision makers and get a real sense of what they were seeing at the time and how and why they were reacting the way they did.
So we live in the age of digitization. How much were you able to get remotely?
A great archive on Vietnam War and Texas Tech. A lot of their stuff is digitized. Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, much of that's digitized. Kennedy Library in Boston. I spent months in College Park, Maryland at the National Archives and Houses of Parliament in Westminster, a military historical center on the Strand. And that was all very interesting because, we didn't have diplomatic relations with Hanoi, right? But the British did. So I could go in and read all their reports from the Hanoi embassy, but then also just like the British defense attachés who were, always, they had guys in Saigon and in all the various, corps commands in Vietnam. And they were like commenting on American actions, and they were like kind of editorializing about the war. And that was also very interesting, and talking about the way that that war was affecting NATO's defense posture.
What's the total elapsed time on this project? How long from the day you started working on it to the day a hard copy was in your hands?
6 years.
Wow. And amazing, the 6-year project, a book. It's getting very well reviewed. You're at the height of your career. I congratulate you. We're out of time. Geoffrey Wawro, thank you. And to all of you who are listening, you can get the book at the usual places, and we'll see you all next week for another important edition of
the Vietnam War and military history.
We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.